Just check with the team it's working. Just check with the team it's working. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, this virtual event on the government's plans to tackle antisocial behaviour. This is a topic that Onward, and I should say I'm Adam Hawksby, I'm Deputy Director of Onward, a topic that Onward have worked on extensively and didn't actually go into some of our work focusing on. We were doing work on levelling up locally, the barriers that people felt were biggest in their local area to feeling a sense of pride in place, to being able to pursue economic growth. And it was very clear from the public, from business leaders, from councillors and others, that feeling safer on the streets, that tackling antisocial behaviour in all its guises was a real priority for them, which is why we expanded our work. And we're delighted to work with many of the people on this call, and indeed the Secretary of State, to try and support and inform the plan that was released on Monday. And that plan is very wide-ranging and very extensive. So I am delighted to have such a wide-ranging panel with a range of different perspectives and experiences on this topic. What we're going to do this morning is give the Secretary of State an opportunity to open and to share some of his thoughts about the reasonings behind the plan, some of the measures within it, and really crucially what happens next to ensure as we move into delivery that it has a rapid impact. Secretary of State needs to pop off, so what we'll do is I'll ask a question to the Secretary of State, maybe take a couple of questions from the chat for him, and then we will turn and make sure we give plenty of time to our panel, who I will introduce as we go through. So without further ado, Secretary of State, Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove, who's been leading this plan, and interesting that it is you, Michael, leading this. This has been positioned within the Department for Levelling Up, working closely with other areas. Would be really keen to hear your thoughts on the plan on Monday, why it's important, and what happens next.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you. I'm very grateful to Onward because the research that you and others have undertaken reinforced something that I knew intuitively, but has been backed up by the data that you've gathered. One of the principal barriers to making sure that communities can feel confident about themselves, that the pride that they have in the places that they live is reflected in their physical environment, and that investment can be secured for those areas, is a sense of calmness, public order, and a public square that is, in every sense of the word, policed effectively and reflective of confidence about the future. Antisocial behaviour takes many forms. It is often described as something that is locally specific, but that's been used in the past. It's true, but it's been used in the past for some to try to suggest that this is a problem which doesn't require a whole of government, England-wide or England and Wales-wide response. It manifestly does. The quality of life that people enjoy is compromised daily by a range of activities that fall under the umbrella of antisocial behaviour. And they range from public drug taking to intimidation on street corners, to vehicle crime, which means that everything from joyriding to e-scooter abuse makes the spaces, the high streets and the parks that should be places of calmness and order, places where others genuinely feel intimidated and fear to go. And of course, the police have to prioritise. The police naturally seek to prioritise those crimes of violence or crimes against property or other offences which are most severe. But there's a real challenge here. We know that if you allow urban areas to become neglected, high streets to become neglected, and if they become the sorts of areas where low-level antisocial behaviour can flourish, there's an environment, a seedbed for further criminality. And so the broken windows theory, popularized, of course, by the American sociologist James Q. Wilson, isn't just a theory, it is an observable reality in so many of our communities. If you have high streets in which shops are shuttered and properties are emptied, there's less footfall in the first place from our citizens. These places become places where instead of order, you have chaos filling the gap. These are the sorts of places where you have young people congregating, gangs recruiting, drug taking place, and a vicious cycle sets in. So what we're seeking to do is to use a series of tools with all of those interested in helping both to restore confidence in communities and to empower agencies to uphold order and to nip crime in the bud. So the first thing that we're doing, borrowing on the academic research that Gordon may be in a position to tell us more about in a second, is recognizing that visible, uniformed presence, policing, PCSOs, in particular crime hotspots, has an effect not of displacing crime, but reducing crime. People need to see that the civic order is being upheld, that there are uniformed individuals who will be there, and that there is a chance of individuals either being caught, but more particularly through that presence, a clear message is being sent that the streets are there for everyone, not just for the lawless and raucous minority. So we're rolling out additional funding with police and crime commissioners in certain areas where there's been an identifiable problem, and we hope to spread that more widely in due course. One of the other things we're doing is instant justice. One of the concerns that people have about antisocial behavior is that if they report it, nothing is done. And then if people are actually apprehended, that there are no sanctions, and certainly no sanctions which are visible and effective. People are sensible. They don't want individuals who are behaving in an antisocial way to acquire a criminal record that stays with them forever, let alone to be incarcerated when they can be diverted away from that activity. So the idea here is that fairly rapidly you have an out-of-court disposal, you have individuals who will be making good the damage that's been caused in their community as quickly as possible. That means both individuals who are concerned about antisocial behavior see that their concerns are addressed, but also reparative, restorative justice provides individuals who have strayed with a clear sense that the boundaries are being upheld, and that they are part of a community, not free riders on that community. Two other elements that I would stress as well as the visible uniform presence and instant justice. We know that many of those who engage in antisocial behavior are young people who have become disengaged from education, so and who lack other purposeful activity in their life. So we're working with the Department for Education to look at how we can make sure that school attendance is improved, so that those students who, particularly post-COVID, may be more likely to be truants or persistent absentees, and therefore drawn into this type of activity, can be brought back into the ambit of an ordered educational environment. But we also recognise that there needs to be other activities for them as well. So money is being made available for the sorts of youth activities that do provide people with a diversion from the lure of the street. And then the final thing is data. The success of everything that we do and the speed with which we can respond depends on effective data analytics and data gathering, and that is critical to the success of the program. So I hope that's helpful. And over to you, Adam. And as I say, we wouldn't have been able to make the progress that we have without the work of Onward in analysing the problem, prescribing certain solutions, and bringing together expertise.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. We've got a couple of questions that have come in already. So people do have questions, and please do drop them into the Q&A function. Let me just open with one, Secretary of State. I've been discussing this topic on the media and around and about over the last few days. And one of the most consistent questions that I've had is around policing culture and proportionality.
Yes.
So at a moment when there are, I think, very legitimate challenges about culture within policing, obviously most acutely in the Met, but also across the country, in terms of racism, misogyny, and other real challenges, how can we be certain that this is the right moment to give police greater discretionary powers, and how can we ensure those powers are used well?
Well, this goes to the whole question of police culture and legitimate authority and broader police reform overall. And it applies in other uniformed services as well. and anyone who can exercise authority over others. Just because authority is abused, just because those in leadership positions have not provided the right or ensured that the right culture prevails within an organization, this should not mean a retreat from legitimate authority overall. So, of course, what's been exposed in the Metropolitan Police is terrible. And the incidences of sexism, homophobia, casual racism, and so on, they are not they shouldn't be used as arguments against authority. It's actually a lack of authority within the Metropolitan Police in making sure that people uphold the values that should be at the heart of policing. That is the issue, and that is something that Mark Rowley, as the Commissioner, completely understands. The thing to do is to make sure that the Met and other police forces are doing their job effectively. What we mustn't succumb to is the idea that the police force should curl up into a ball because of its failure. What it needs to do is to demonstrate that it's putting things right, that its internal procedures are correct, that those who are who should never have been in the police force in the first place are kicked out. But we need the police to exercise that authority, because if not them, who?
Thank you, Michael. Let me come to a few questions that have come in, and I'll give you three if that's okay, so you can kind of deal with them as they come. So one of them from Eddie Tolesovic, who has asked about street pastors, and actually you can kind of broaden that. So he talks about street pastors, their role of tackling antisocial behaviour, but actually more broadly, what do you see as the role of community organisations of different forms, kind of religious and otherwise? So that would be the first one. Second, from Eleanor here, who's asked about many local problems happening at night. So how can we ensure there's coverage from police at night? And there's another question which broadly looks at that issue of policing numbers. How can we ensure there's a specific number around? And then a third from someone who's asked about the rent arrears section 106 element of this. How can we ensure that new powers that deal with problematic antisocial behaviour of tenants doesn't affect some of those vulnerable in society? So kind of community groups, policing numbers particularly at night, and then vulnerable renters.
Okay, three very good points. On the first point, the police are obviously the most visible and powerful manifestation of civic authority, but there are all sorts of other ways in which responsible adults can play a part in helping to ensure that the public square is a more orderly and also a kinder and a gentler place. Because the withdrawal of authority and order doesn't lead to its replacement by kindness, it leads to its replacement by chaos. So the more that you can have people who are there to monitor, to support, and to direct, the better. So firstly, if you can't have police officers, then PCSOs are a good idea. If you can't have PCSOs, then local government paying for community wardens is a good idea. But one other thing which again is very powerful is the idea of street pastors or street angels in some cases, individuals who volunteer to offer help and support to people who are in difficult circumstances and who might in particular ways cause trouble for themselves and others if they're not attended to. So I think it is absolutely the right thing to do and to support. And again, our country has depended and continues to depend on the kindness of people, often inspired by their faith, to help and to support others, and we should welcome that. On police numbers, particularly at night, again, the police face many pressures on their time, but part of the role of police and crime commissioners, like the excellent Katie Bourne, is to work with chief constables and to say, yes, we respect your operational independence, of course, but we have policing by consent in this country. And policing by consent means that chief constables and others cannot ignore public concern about order. So when we're thinking, and the very best chief constables exhibit this every day, when we're thinking about maintaining confidence in the police, that might sometimes mean that resourcing is taken away from one or two of the areas that some chief constables have tended to prioritize in the past towards those which the public are concerned about. And it's the role of the PCC to hold the and other elected politicians to hold the chief constables to that. And critically, that means having more visible police presence at times when, in particular, women and girls are at risk. And then the final point about Section 21, I think we have a balanced package on renters reform. Section 21, we are committed to abolishing. For those on the call who are not aware of it, it is a provision that gives landlords the right to evict someone without having to provide a justification. It's no-fault eviction. And it's abused by some landlords who use it to threaten or intimidate tenants by saying, look, if you complain, you're going to be kicked out. And it's also used in the same way to try to get tenants moved out so that rents can be jacked up, so that the lack of demand overall can be used by landlords in order to make bigger profits, and the people who lose out are tenants. I've said in the past that I think that the relationship between landlord and tenant is different from the relationship between a customer and a service provider, like the relationship that you or I might have with Netflix or Sky, because it's our home. And there does need to be a protection for tenants as well as being a protection for the property rights of landlords. But the quid pro quo for that is that landlords do need to be able to have certainty that they can evict antisocial tenants more quickly than is the case at the moment. And that's not just because they, in losing Section 21, lose one tool. They need to have a sharper tool, as it were, to ensure vacant possession when required. But more importantly, from my point of view, landlords have a responsibility to other tenants and to other neighbours. And the antisocial behaviour of a tenant may damage the property from the landlord's point of view, but it damages the community from a neighbour's point of view. And that's why we're extending the powers not just to private landlords, but to social landlords as well.
Excellent. Michael, thank you so much. There are other questions flooding in, but I'm conscious both of your time and of the others that we've gathered for the conversation. So if you do need to pop off, Michael, very, very happy for you to do so. And thank you very much for giving up your time. Let's turn to some of the others on the panel to dissect some of this. Lord Herbert, Nick Herbert, let me come to you first. You've been a policing minister previously, now chair the College of Policing. I've thought about this prior to that in your role in kind of think tanks and elsewhere. Give us a sense of why kind of now feels like a particularly important moment to tackle antisocial behaviour, and how the measures that were announced in the plan yesterday landed with you.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks very much indeed to Onward for doing this and for inviting me on. I think the action plan is really good, and I think it's got all of the key elements that are needed to try and get a grip of antisocial behaviour. I think what's interesting is the way in which this apparently fell down political agendas, and I mean agendas nationally and locally. And over the course of the last 2 years as chair of the College of Policing, when I think of all the meetings that we've been invited to attend with government to discuss policing matters, antisocial behaviour wasn't one of them. And there was a focus on other things such as crimes that relating to particular harm and so on, more serious crimes. I think it's true that this issue has returned to the top of political agendas, and the Prime Minister has sent a very strong signal that it needs to be dealt with, and that's welcome. And I agree with Michael very strongly that the fact that there have been issues with the Metropolitan Police and so on is absolutely not a reason to encourage action in this area. In fact, I think a key way to rebuild confidence between the police and the public is for the police to be addressing issues of public concern. And I think one of the things that we know from survey evidence is the public feel that antisocial behaviour is not sufficiently prioritised, that it is not taken seriously, and feel that the police are not dealing with it effectively. Of course, the police face all sorts of pressures, and this isn't a matter for the police alone, but putting it up there on the political agenda is the first step to take effective action. And that's why I really welcome the Prime Minister's lead on this, Michael's lead, and the action plan to say this matters. Antisocial behaviour accounts for something like a fifth of all police recorded incidents, and actually probably that is an underestimate of the extent to which this is really a problem. The key elements that are there, the fact that it prioritizes swift and visible justice. And 10 years ago, I produced a government white paper on swift and sure justice. And I think too often the state behaves like a bad parent rather than a good parent. You know, a bad parent tolerates repeated offending and doesn't set clear boundaries, doesn't do anything about it, ultimately escalates sometimes randomly. And a good parent sets very clear boundaries. I think offending should always have consequences. Bad behavior should always have consequences. And too often we don't follow that practice in the criminal justice system. So I think ensuring that justice is swift, that it's visible or sure, I think is a key element. Secondly, that the accountability is there. I think there's a big question, why hasn't effective action been taken to deal with antisocial behavior? Why didn't the system respond? And if nobody's sure whose responsibility it is to deal with this, then things fall between two stools. You have to put somebody in charge and make it clear to them they are responsible for dealing with this. And I think putting police and crime commissioners at the center of this is a good thing. That's why we invented police and crime commissioners. They are meant to be responsible for this. Good police and crime commissioners like Katie do take action. That needs to be more wide spread. So I think making a reality of the and crime part of police and crime commissioners' job description, deploying technology to ensure that there is real accountability is again a really good step forward. Thirdly, that there should be a greater uniform presence, and Michael spoke about this. I disagree with Michael that it's in the use of language about if you can't have police. Actually, I think a wider policing family is a good thing. There are lots of elements of antisocial behavior that aren't necessarily best dealt with by the police, but can be dealt with by people who otherwise are empowered, who have a uniform presence. I saw it in my former constituency in Katie's area, where we had wardens in a rural area. They were really popular. The local communities paid for them out of their local rates every year because they valued them, and they can pick up a lot of the issues of antisocial behavior. And I think this is horses for courses. I think it has to be locally decided, but the white paper that the action plan provides funding for this in the trial areas, and I think that's a really good thing. We have denuded neighborhood policing over the recent years, and that has to be rebuilt. And the thing I would implore to both major political parties is to look again at whether more should not be provided in terms of resource for neighborhood policing, and that's policing in the widest sense: police officers, PCSOs, wardens. This is a really good step forward, but actually I think both major parties, the Labour Party has got there with a promise for more neighborhood police officers. I think there's questions about how real that is and how that's being funded, but it's the right ambition. And actually I think the Conservatives should look very carefully at pledging to match that or more in future. And lastly, I think where I'd like to see this go further is in giving more power to neighbourhoods. To really putting neighbourhoods in charge. There are good measures in the action plan that step in this direction. But I think the more we can empower local communities, people want the police and others to take action. They don't want to be sort of felt that they're left on their own to deal with things. But I think if we can put communities in charge and make them part of the mechanism of holding police and others to account, give neighborhood groups real power of determination, including over the disposals, and to ensure that punishment is swift, effective, visible, locally driven where appropriate. The more we can put neighborhoods back in charge, the more I think we will enhance the accountability that's really necessary in this area.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick, particularly on that point on neighbourhoods. And I think that is probably something we'll come back to in this discussion. Katie, let me come to you. You've been name dropped twice already, so it feels like this is the point we should let you in. You're coming into your third term now, I think, as the Police and Crime Commissioner in Sussex. Be good to hear about your reflections, particularly on the PCC's role as envisaged in the plan yesterday, and some of the things that are going to be important so that you and PCC colleagues can deliver on some of the promises and pledges that are in the action plan.
Yes, thanks, Adam. Always nice to be hat-tipped, but then you start to worry, don't you? So I really welcome this action plan, and everything that the Secretary of State has said and Lord Herbert has said previously, totally endorse. What's exciting for me in it is that we are being trusted as police and crime commissioners to do some of these pilots ourselves. So in my area in Sussex, we're going to be one of the immediate justice pilot areas. And I'm really excited about that because, we've already got a framework in place in Sussex, our community remedy framework, but actually this gives me an opportunity to really give it a good poke and put some funding there to say, are we using that quick justice piece as quickly and as swiftly and as effectively as we should be? Because at the moment, the police officer will get a list of 5 choices that he or she can offer to a victim of the crime. And as long as the offender has admitted what they've done, the victim can then choose from that menu what they want to do. Now, what I'm finding is that very often officers will go for the easier option, which can be the letter of apology, which for me doesn't really feel as strong as perhaps the offender having to clean the graffiti themselves. So I'm really looking forward to pulling together that program of work to see what we can do to make that more visible, immediate justice in local communities. But just quickly before I finish, one of the points that was made was around the volume of antisocial behaviour and how it slipped down in the sort of the psyche. For me, because I lead on behalf of my colleagues around business crime, what I've seen over the last few years is that less than 10% of all antisocial behaviour that's been happening in our retail environments goes anywhere near being reported to the police. So there's a huge volume of ASB, the abuse, whether it's verbal, physical, and so on, that's happening, isn't being reported. And so the police haven't actually, they haven't been aware of it, but they haven't been dealing with it. And now, because it's not been dealt with, those individuals have felt really emboldened because they've been getting away with it for so long. So it's now spilling out into our towns and our villages and our public realm spaces. And I think that's why now is absolutely the right time to really tackle this. And neighbourhood policing is right at the core to this. So I keep it nice and brief.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Katie. Really appreciate it. And I'll come back to, I think, on some of the practicalities of delivery, because I think that is where we should ensure this conversation gets to. And Didi, let me come to you. I think what was really interesting for Onward in our work on this is that while lots of people said that antisocial behaviour was driven by young people in focus groups, and there's some evidence to indicate that that's partially the case, although it's clearly complicated, there was no real desire for punitive measures against young people, actually no desire to go back to kind of ASBOs or whatever else. But in fact, lots of people said, I don't blame young people. There's not enough to do around here. There aren't enough productive opportunities. And what an investment in both diversionary activities, but also real and serious opportunities around employment. So when you're kind of in your role as the CEO of UK Youth, how did you feel in reading the plan yesterday, and what things are going to be really important for the government to get right?
Hi, thanks, Adam. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a really interesting conversation so far, so much to come back on. I think for me, first of all, we really welcome the specific pieces, I think, that touch on outside of school resources that young people, we know young people are lacking. So I think there was £11 million mentioned there to provide resource funding for youth organisations who are operating in the hotspots to provide extra hours of youth provision. I think it's 1 million hours that we're going for. I think when we talk about antisocial behaviour and crime in particularly, or crime perpetuated by young people, the focus is often on the consequences, the victims, the impact on communities, and rightly so, by the way. However, I know we're not halfway through yet, but we haven't talked about why yet in this conversation. We haven't talked about why these things are happening. And I do think that when you're thinking about solutions, you have to consider the root causes behind them. Otherwise, you're just in a perpetual doom cycle, as it were. And I think particularly when it comes to young people, even as a society, I think we're in danger of forgetting that what's happened over the last few years and the seismic impact that's had on young people's lives, completely disrupting their experiences of education, employment prospects, mental health. We're now looking at the consequences of them and dealing with them as if they are the problem, as opposed to understanding what has led to that. We know reports have shown without significant intervention, these issues are going to keep having long-term scarring effects on generations of young people. So, and then on top of that, we're now going through a cost of living crisis that obviously the whole nation is facing. But once again, think about the impact of young people on that. So I'm with you. Let me be super clear. I do not think criminalizing young people is the solution to this issue. I don't actually think focusing on the consequences, tightening of policing powers, fear tactics, showing a strong hand, I don't think that's the solution to this issue, particularly as it pertains to young people either. Only, let me at least say that. I think we have to get really serious about a proactive multi-agency response. And again, I know we're not halfway through, but policing is what we're talking about. And I loved your question. I think Michael asked it earlier about if not the police, then who? Actually, there's a whole range of people that I think would be really important in this conversation. And you hopefully won't be surprised to hear from me that I think youth workers are being forgotten out of this conversation. Qualified professionals who operate from a detached perspective, who know exactly how to work with young people in these circumstances. I think the point I want to make, because often when you talk about this, it feels soft, it feels nice to have, it feels really happy-go-lucky. And actually, there's a real hard economic value to this. In November last year, we launched a report called Untapped. We worked with the most critical economic research consultancy that we could find, because we really wanted to be scrutinized under this. And we launched a report to look into the economic value of youth work. And actually the report blew anything that we were hoping to find out of the water. The report demonstrates that youth work itself has huge social and economic benefits to both young people, but also to their local communities. And one of the key findings I just want to share is that, for example, every £1 the government invests in youth work, the benefit to the taxpayer is at least £3.20 and could be up to £6.40. The areas that were identified, again, not intentionally sought, but the areas that came out of the research found that, we worked with Frontier Economics, by the way, they found that the total indirect value of youth work sector to the country is again, conservatively, £3.2 billion. There is 0.5 billion from decreased numbers of crime, 1.7 billion from improved health, and 0.8 billion from increased employment and education. Like, listen to those figures and think about the conversation that we're having here, and think about the solutions that came out in the report, and the amount of attention we are placing on proactive upstream solutions. I think if we're being truly solution focused, I think we really have to have a true rethink about what sustained investment in youth work to support young people needs to look like. I think it has a pivotal role in repairing the issues impacting communities such as antisocial behaviour, but it's not a nice to have. It has real power. And at the moment, I think we can go further, and everything we're doing is welcomed, completely recognised. But if we are talking about truly changing this context, we cannot keep having conversations that are just about dealing with the end result. And I think youth work has a far more critical role in this debate than it's currently having.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's excellent. That's really appreciated. And I think we'll come back to that issue of prevention and how we ensure that we are not just perpetuating that same cycle. One of the really important partners you mentioned, I think, in this is going to be local authorities. It's going to be councils. So we're delighted that Councillor James Jameson, for the Conservative Councillor, Central Bedfordshire, but also the chairman of the Local Government Association. James, clearly local authorities and councils via community safety partnerships has a really key role in tackling antisocial behaviour. How did the report yesterday land with you? Any elements you think are missing or are going to be particularly key?
So I think, as the speakers have already indicated, that there is a huge raft of things that impact antisocial behaviour, and there is lots of good stuff in this report. And, I would very much say this moves us forward. But I think, particularly as Ndidi was just implying, it isn't everything. So I think there's a very important role in prevention. where are safe communities? Safe communities are where you have great places and great communities, and you don't just do that by a policing presence. So interestingly, the policing presence is not just about preventing people committing crime. It is actually also about making people feel safe. So you have more people entering that park or that town centre or that place. So it has a double benefit. It's not just about prevention, it's about encouraging people to use that space. And therefore, because there are more people, that space becomes safer anyway. And it is all about that policing by consent. And the key to me is place, and place really matters. And the report does refer to, these rundown town centres or parks or so forth, which should be the hub of the community, not being either because there are shops that are shut or because there is antisocial behaviour going on in a park. Really important that we address that. And some of that is about policing, some of that's about enforcement, but a big chunk about that is actually about how do we encourage good behaviours? How do we provide alternatives? So yes, youth work's very important. Design's really important. How do you design a place? Having town centres where nobody lives. Are you surprised that it's a dark space at night, that nobody's there? Whereas if you go to a vibrant community where people live, it's a very alternative things. Really pleased with some of the stuff around enabling us to move on empty shops. I would actually like to broaden that to empty commercial buildings in totality. And I think we shouldn't just have a view that these buildings, it's about getting another vibrant shop. I mean, the world is changing. We need to think about housing and so forth. And really the importance of aspiration for people. If people haven't got any aspiration, then they are, going to look for any alternative that they can. If they've got aspiration, they're working towards something. So whether that's youth workers, whether that's teachers, whether that's careers advisors, providing people with aspiration and opportunity. And, one of the programs that hasn't been mentioned that has been hugely successful is Troubled Families. And that's about cross-sector working. And I think that's the key point here, is it's cross-sector. And I'm, agnostic as to who's leading it, so long as we have genuine cross-sector working on that. So I think that's hugely important. Prevention is hugely important, but we must remember policing by consent. And I agree with everyone else. We have not paid enough attention to antisocial behaviour because, everybody starts on the ladder to crime somewhere. And if we can remove that ladder, then we're going to be a better society.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. Really appreciated. Professor Sherman, let's come to you. I think you've been working on this obviously for decades, for a significant period of time, focusing on data-driven policing, hotspots policing, and yesterday's action plan really focuses in on those methods as being central to some of the pilots that have been introduced. What did you think of the plan yesterday, and are there particular elements in terms of delivery, use of data, that are going to be important? You're on mute, Professor Sherman.
Sorry. I was delighted that Secretary Gove made the use of data analytics a central part of the vision here. And I think it's challenged by the fact that unlike murders or robberies, antisocial behavior has a very low rate of incident reports generated. Police are very busy doing lots of other things. If they get a call that there's been noise or rudeness at a certain location, by the time the police get there, everybody's gone, there's nobody to talk to, and they don't write an incident report. So I think that we have to go back to the beginning of the research on hotspots, where the measure was not offense reports, it was calls for service. Every time a police car was dispatched to a specific street address in Minneapolis, that address was written down. And in those days, they didn't have a good way to prevent different names. So for the worst hotspot in the city, we had to use 27 different addresses, but they were all about the same Moby Dick's bar on Hennepin Avenue, which could be Moby's or Moby Dick's or whatever. That's now a problem that's been solved. And the best measure for antisocial behavior would be disturbance, or even ASB is sometimes the label. There's a variety of labels or categories that can be used. And if we target the resources that this program is going to provide at the locations that have the highest volumes and at specific times of day and days of the week when those volumes are peaking. If we can use that level of precision, we'll get a lot more out of the taxpayers' money than if the traditional approach in the last several decades of implementing hotspots policing has been a kind of, very often it's a conversation rather than looking at data. And a number of our studies at Cambridge have shown that the identification of the hotspots has been simply way off. It's not consistent with the data. And that ranges right across the UK, that the sense that we know where the hotspots are is something that is a barrier to actually focusing on hotspots. And the other issue is how long you stay there. We have lots of good evidence that shows 10 to 15 minute period gets a residual effect after the police leaves that can last from a half hour up to 4 days in areas that don't get very much patrol, which might be true in some of the rural areas of England and Wales. And to be able to think with the officers who rarely have been trained in how to do hotspots policing, whether it's for antisocial behavior or even for violent crime, if we can get everybody on board about the idea that it really has a reducing effect, as Mr. Gove said, and not just a displacement effect, because all of the evidence against displacement has been consistent, that instead of actually pushing crime around, you even lower crime in the surrounding areas where the police didn't patrol, but where they were close enough to those areas to make a difference, even on the tube in London, as one of our experiments shows. And to be able to do this with greater precision, but not being there too long, not wasting, shall we say, time that was more than enough to create the deterrent effect, and taking away from time in another location. That's going to take quite a bit of care, and places like Thames Valley Police and some others have been very good about working with their officers to track not only the targeting of the police to the right areas, but tracking how much time they're actually spending there, and using the GPS systems to feed back to the individual officers and to encourage the teams that do this to pay attention to their scorecard and the extent to which they're actually being there. That might be something that the data analysts can help demonstrate by showing how much the number of calls in each hotspot has gone down in relation to the intermittent police presence in 15-minute periods in those places. If they're more consistently delivered some weeks than others, and you're seeing the calls for service dropping, where you're getting the precision policing, that would give more encouragement to have the officers stay focused on that, and perhaps prioritizing it relative to other demands, which is something that can be done in collaboration with the call centers and the analysts working with the call centers to try to ring fence the time that police are supposed to be spending in some of these hotspot areas, especially if they're also centers of violent crime, especially crimes of violence against women and girls. We can actually use the data analytics to have multiple goals accomplished in the same patrols, but it just needs to be given constant attention. And I think the previous funding for GRIP was able to do that in a number of forces, and other forces not so much. So it really does come back to police commissioners, police and crime commissioners and others, I think, looking at this question of how is this extra money being used? Can we get the most out of it? How do we document leadership and team building practices with the officers who are going to do the work, especially in partnership with PCSOs, and research in Britain shows that they can be just as effective, if not more so, in delivering the kind of light touch intervention that the patrols in town centers or other places where young people gather. It can be done really well, or it can be done very badly. And metrics about that perhaps can be drawn from the body-worn video footage of how the officers are interacting with the young people in those areas, or whoever's causing the ASB, giving the scores in the 4 dimensions of how police interact with citizens. which have been used in Sussex and Essex and Greater Manchester. And a number of places have used this kind of analysis to focus not just on the quantities of ASB policing, but also on the qualitative dimensions of how they relate to young people. Do they listen to them when they're talking? Do they try to treat them with respect? And most importantly, are they expressing a trustworthy motive? We are here to help you be safer. We're here to help this be a more attractive community. And then failing that, using some of the powers to order dispersal that have been a part of this practice for a long time. But to say ultimately this is the most evidence-based focus for dealing with a widespread problem that you can identify in policing. We've had over 80 tests of this approach using antisocial behavior as the outcome, and almost consistently demonstrating that the effects are there and that the effects are stronger when they're concentrated in these 15-minute minimum. Well, 10 to 15-minute windows would be the objective. And to the extent the program can focus on these data analytics, I think everybody's going to be pleased with the outcomes of that component of this plan.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Sherman, and good to anchor some of this in the evidence about what works. On that evidence, John Yates, let's come to you. So, Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, you've done a huge amount of work, particularly to Ndidi's point earlier on the need to balance any policing approaches with a range of other approaches to tackle specifically youth violence that you've worked on, but I know you've also touched on low-level crime and antisocial behaviour. So, John, kind of how does yesterday score against your kind of what works measures? Which of it feels like it resonates with the evidence and which bits might be missing?
Thanks, Adam. I mean, as a what works centre, our job, as you say, is to say, you know, what does the evidence say? So you'd hardly expect me to look at a government report or a plan and say, A star, everything's absolutely perfect. But I think there's a lot here to like. Any serious plan to address antisocial behaviour or crime or serious violence has to start by recognising these things as sticky. They stick to certain places and they stick to certain people. So you've got to have a plan that's, first of all, really is going to be evidence-based around the places and evidence-based around the people. I think on the places side, I mean, Professor Sherman has absolutely nailed it from my point of view. Hotspots policing has incredibly strong evidence. Two things. One, we're going to have to keep on pointing this out. Please get bored of hotspots policing because you're patrolling and walking around the same area for 15 minutes every day, and they can lose interest in it. We actually need as leaders to say, this is important, it really works. It's preventing crime, it's keeping people safe. The second is you have to have the data analysts to work with the data. And as we put more police back, we must make sure that we also are investing in the data analytics, because otherwise it's not going to work. Let's look at the people side. I think it's a question of almost the government's written an exam paper here, and they've not quite turned over the page and done the last page. So what I mean by that is they've done the bit around children who are arrested, which is a really important area to target. And they said, look, why don't we provide better support to children who get arrested? They're not taken to court, they're not being charged. Let's not just ignore them. Let's get them some mentoring. Let's prevent this happening again. And the plan says we're going to be serious about that. And I think the evidence would entirely back that up. But I think there's three other groups of young people that also we should be targeting. One is children who are absent. The second is children who lack an adult role model. And the third is children who've been abused or experienced trauma in their lives. So 3 A's, if you like: absent, lacking an adult, and abuse. And I'm delighted to hear the Secretary of State earlier say the DfE are going to be really pushed on an absence reduction plan. And I look forward to seeing that in more detail. But we have a real problem at the moment. Double the number of children are absent from school than was the case before the pandemic. And there's a really high correlation between absence and this sort of antisocial behaviour and crime and violence. On adults being absent, the evidence is almost as strong as it is for hotspots policing for mentoring. and the power of giving a young person a mentor that they can connect with, meet with regularly, get advice from. And I'd really love to see some more ambitious thoughts about how we might put mentors. We've got a programme we're funding and evaluating, putting mentors in a borough in London into schools where there are real issues around violence. And we know the children are there. Let's put the mentors there. The final one is then children who've experienced abuse and trauma. We know that that's a common cause of children then going on to get into all sorts of difficulties. We also have phenomenally good evidence that for what helps, and it's therapy. And it sounds soft. Oh, we're going to be kind and nice and give someone a therapist. I don't really care if it's that soft. I care that it works. And I care that it means that there's less antisocial behaviour, less violence, and less crime. For me, it's not about being hard or soft on crime. It's about being smart on crime. And we do have a real challenge about children who need it getting access to CAMS, to mental health provision, to therapy. And so that would be a priority I would add. The final thing I'd just note is there's a word we haven't really talked about at all today, and that's family. That actually, why is it that children lack an adult that they can trust? Why is it that children end up often absent from school? Why is it they often end up being arrested? Why is it that they often end up experiencing abuse and trauma? It's because adults who have the responsibility to look after them are struggling. And actually, we do need to take seriously what can we do to solidify and strengthen, sometimes intervene quite heavily when we need to, those families. And I think the role of children's services, which is the bit of the state that we fund to try and strengthen families, is something we will need to talk more and more about. And often we sometimes treat children's services as, oh, it's that bit I don't really understand that does nice stuff for children. It's not. It's the bit that tries to strengthen the family so that a child doesn't end up in these sort of difficulties in the first place. And I think we will have to wrestle with how much funding does it need? And we'll have to wrestle with, is it good enough quality? And I hope that in time, the conversation might increasingly go in that direction.
Excellent. Thank you, John. So huge amount covered there, and we've got a very limited time for questions. So what I actually want to do is try and get to some of the points I don't think we've touched on that have come up in the Q&A. One of them is about adults. I think rightly this conversation is focused a lot on young people, but actually one thing that came through very clearly in our focus groups is a very small number of adults, often whom are rough sleeping, are begging, are under the influence of or addicted to alcohol or drugs, make up for a disproportionate number of complaints. And there are some measures in the plan on Monday to both intervene, to move along individuals like that, but probably more importantly, to support them in various ways. Katie, let me come to you on this first about adults and antisocial behaviour, and in particular, those small number of individuals that might represent a disproportionate number of complaints. And then, James, I want to come to you as well, because I know councils have a key role here. So, Katie.
Sure. The government's already been running, I think, about 8 pilot areas under Project Adder, which is the addiction and drugs enforcement kind of program. And Sussex has benefited from funding, and we've got a Project Adder running in Hastings. And that's targeting those adults who have substance abuse issues and working. It's been led by health. There has been an element in there funding for police, which is more around the enforcement piece. But the actual health bit of it is about getting them off the streets and into those rehabilitative programs. And there's quite a lot of data now coming back from Project Adder, which is very positive, and that it has a real benefit. So I think they're spot on. When it's adults that are causing this, it's either driven by alcohol or drugs in the majority of cases. And so there are these pilots out there that other areas can look at and get a lot of learning from, which really benefits in the long run.
Excellent. James, your thoughts on this?
So I think one of the things we've maybe not touched on enough, and I'd say it with adults and the comment about children's services earlier, is it's about cross-sector working. And, Adder is about trying to put additional funding into an area so that the sector, across the sector, whether it's health, police, housing, homelessness, benefit system, work together. And that's how you tackle these things. And so generally, if you have a rough sleeper, I'd almost guarantee that they have a drug or an alcohol or a mental health issue. Councils can't solve those three. We need the health system to solve that, but we also need the support of the police, ditto, the police need our support. So, you know, it is that cross-sector working, and the comment, and thank you earlier about children's services, hugely important. But what we can't do is say, it's your problem, you fix it, children's services or police or housing. We've got to find a way. And so one of the things that's not in this report that I would really like is to have a duty to cooperate on all parts of the sector. So whoever's leading, fine, but the other parts of the sector have a duty to cooperate with them, which I think is fundamentally important.
Thank you, James. A few questions that have come in that are in different ways about delivery, about resources, or about technology. And Nick, let me come to you on this first. I think a lot of people in listening to the action plan yesterday, particularly things like we're going to make people clear up graffiti in 48 hours, you know, this kind of rapid justice, are looking at the state of their local police forces and saying, well, hang on, how on earth is any of this going to be feasible? The current burden is not deliverable with the resources we've got. So is this just a question of increasing resources and some of the other trappings are less relevant?
Well, I already indicated that I think we do need to increase resource for neighbourhood policing, and you know, that's a decision that has to be taken, you know, nationally by the government, and it's welcome that there is additional resource provided through this action plan for the hotspot areas, but I think we need to go further. I do think that technology does have a big potential role to play, and that's pointed to in the action plan. It's not very specific about, you know, how the accountability will work, or what the platform is going to be. As the kind of architect for police.uk and street level crime mapping, you know, I always wanted that to be the platform, you know, by which there would be much more than just telling you about crime and antisocial behaviour in your area, that you would also be able to affect action, you'd be able to see what had been done. And I really hope that it might be possible to develop that platform. And of course, there is the police 101 number. What's interesting is that the public have a kind of reticence even about calling that number. There's a sort of feeling that there is a lot of incidents of antisocial behaviour that people don't want to bother what they think is the police about. And we've somehow got to get over that. We've got to ensure that where people see things that they themselves may feel are sub-criminal, but nevertheless are offensive, that they want dealt with in their area, whether it's things like graffiti or littering, or all the things that are talked about as being the kind of low-level things that can, you know, escalate and affect the quality of life in neighborhoods. People do feel that they can easily report these things, that action will be taken, and that they can see that action will be taken. And the problem is it's too dispersed at the moment. People don't know where to go to. They're not sure that action will be taken. The action that's taken is not reported to them. And I don't think we've mastered the opportunity which technology should give us at a very local level, whereby people can go somewhere, they'd know where to go, they can report stuff, and they'd see that action had been taken. So I think there is a huge opportunity to deploy a really good technological solution to this that would ensure that the agencies collectively were accountable, and that action were taken. And I don't think it's just about resource. I think it's about ensuring that accountability is there. You know, there is multiple resource available, whether it's through local authorities or whether it's through the policing institutions and so on. And the problem is that it's not ever clear who is responsible, and it's certainly not clear to the public. And that's what we have to crack if action is really going to be taken, and so on. So that's what I think we have the opportunity in these hotspot areas to trial. And I think technology has got to be a big part of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. We have reached time, so I'll have to finish the discussion here. Thank you so much to everyone participating online, to all of you that turned up, but particularly to our speakers today. Very, very grateful for you giving up your time and engaging with this debate. I am certain that this will not be the last we hear of this topic. It is very clearly becoming a political battleground for both parties. And I think rightly and helpfully that actually some contestation, some interest in this area can hopefully generate some new ideas and some positive action. So thank you very much to everyone for tuning in today. Thank you to my panelists, and hope to see you at a future Onward event soon. Thanks very much.